The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. But what happens when something defies every sensor, every theory, every rational explanation? What happens when the impossible doesn't just arrive, it explodes onto the bridge of Starfleet's finest vessel? Captain Jean-Luc Picard was reviewing reports from the neutral zone when the alarms began. Not the red alert, something worse. The transporter chief's panicked voice crackled across the comm. "Captain, we have a massive energy surge in transporter room 3. Chronoton particles flooding the entire system. It's not a normal malfunction." The bridge shook. Not violently, but with an undeniable, sickening lurch. Data's optical sensors flickered yellow as he processed the sensor data streaming across his console. "Captain, the transporter systems are attempting to stabilize a materialization, but the energy signature is inconsistent with Federation technology. Dimensional variance detected. Temporal distortion markers present. Lock down all transporter systems," Picard commanded, his voice steady despite the wrongness settling into his bones. "Red alert. Yellow alert. Whatever we're dealing with." The bridge doors hissed open violently, and Chief Engineer Geordie LaForge burst through, his visor blazing with diagnostic readouts. "Captain, we've got a situation. The transporter buffer's destabilizing. Something's trying to materialize, but the pattern's being corrupted by chronoton radiation. If I don't get those particles under control, we could have a cascade failure that takes out half the ship's systems. Can you stabilize it?" Picard asked. "Working on it, but Captain, the energy signature is massive. Whatever this is, it's big, it's hot, and it doesn't match anything in our database." Then the view screen erupted into white light. For 3 seconds, the entire bridge was bathed in impossible luminescence, blue-white, crackling, alive with energy. That made every console spark and every officer shield their eyes. The lights flickered. The hum of the Enterprise's engines pitched higher, stressed, struggling against whatever was forcing its way into their reality. And then it stopped. The transporter room, displayed on the main view screen, showed a figure materializing. Not smoothly, like a normal transport. This was violent. Chaotic. Like something being forced through a keyhole it was never designed for. When the light cleared, a man stood in transporter room 3. He was massive, 6'4" at minimum, broad-shouldered, muscular with the kind of physiology that suggested extreme genetic modification or decades of combat conditioning. He wore a ripped white tank top that revealed a physique that looked sculpted from marble and reinforced with steel. His skin was tanned, his hair blonde and swept back in a style that belonged to no known human culture Picard recognized. Around his waist was a holster, except it wasn't a phaser. It was something older, more primitive. Something that looked like a firearm from Earth's 20th century. The man's eyes snapped open. They were wild, disoriented, survival-focused. His hand immediately went to the weapon at his hip. "Red alert!" Picard commanded. "All hands to battle stations. Security teams to transporter room 3, now." The man's lips curled into a snarl. He drew the weapon. It was definitely a gun, early 21st century Earth design, 45 caliber automatic, and fired 3 rounds into the transporter console. Sparks erupted. Alarms screamed. "I am Duke Nukem," the man roared, his voice a gravelly baritone that carried the weight of absolute certainty. "And I want to know who the hell just kidnapped me and where I am." The bridge fell silent for a heartbeat. Even Picard, who had faced the Borg, the Q continuum, and countless hostile encounters across the quadrant, needed a moment to process what he was witnessing. "Security, set phasers to stun," Picard said quietly. "Transporter room 3 is sealed. No one enters or exits without my authorization. Shields up. And somebody tell me what in the name of science just happened." Data's fingers flew across his console. Captain, I am detecting severe chronoton particle contamination throughout the ship's systems. The transporter malfunction appears to have created a localized temporal anomaly. However, the individual's origin signature does not match any Federation database. His genetic structure is human. Predominantly. But with modifications I have never encountered. He appears to be from Earth, but the temporal marker suggests. Data paused, his positronic brain struggling with the impossibility. Approximately 300 years in the past. That's impossible, Geordi said, arriving on the bridge now. A temporal displacement of that magnitude would require technology we don't even have theoretical models for. Captain, the chronoton radiation is spreading through the ship. If we don't contain it soon, we could have a cascade failure in the warp core. In Transporter Room 3, Duke Nukem stood defiant, the gun still smoking in his hand. He was breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the transporter room with the tactical awareness of a predator assessing a trap. His skin was already showing signs of strain, faint lines of discoloration spreading from his temples, like the chronoton radiation was burning through him from the inside out. He didn't understand Federation technology. He didn't understand that the gun he just fired would be useless against shields, against phasers, against a starship that could vaporize him from 1,000 kilometers away. All he understood was survival. Dominance. Finding the enemy and eliminating it before it eliminated him. Come on, you alien bastards, he snarled, loading fresh ammunition into the magazine. Duke Nukem has faced worse than you. I've fought monsters that would make your nightmares scream. Let's rock. On the bridge, Picard leaned back in his command chair, steepling his fingers. Whatever had just arrived aboard his ship, it wasn't Starfleet. It wasn't Klingon, Romulan, or any known adversary. It was something far more unpredictable, a warrior from Earth's violent past, now loose on the Federation's flagship, contaminating the ship with temporal radiation that threatened the entire vessel. And it had a gun. Establish a containment field around Transporter Room 3, Picard ordered. Evacuate all non-essential personnel from that section. And get me a full medical and genetic workup on that individual. I want to know everything about him. Where he's from. What he is. And most importantly, how we're going to contain something that doesn't follow any of the rules we understand. He turned to Worf, his tactical officer. Commander, what's your assessment? Worf's jaw tightened. His hand rested on the phaser at his hip, but there was something else in his eyes, a recognition, perhaps. The kind of respect a warrior gives to another warrior, even if that warrior represents chaos and violation of every protocol Starfleet held dear. He is dangerous, Worf said simply. And he is afraid. A dangerous thing to be afraid. The Enterprise D hummed around them, its systems straining against the chronoton radiation, its crew mobilizing against an unknown threat. And in Transporter Room 3, Duke Nukem stood defiant against a future he didn't understand, convinced that wherever he was, whatever had brought him here, he would fight his way out. He always did. What he didn't know, what none of them yet understood, was that his arrival had already set forces in motion. The Romulans had detected the temporal anomaly. Section 31 was monitoring the incident from the shadows. And the Federation was about to face a question it had never seriously entertained. What happens when a being from humanity's violent past collides with humanity's enlightened future? The answer would reshape everything. Captain Picard entered the observation lounge with the calculated composure of a man who had negotiated with gods and reasoned with monsters. Behind him came Counselor Deanna Troi, her empathic senses already struggling with the raw, primal emotions radiating from the containment field in Transporter Room 3. Security Chief Worf walked at Picard's right, his hand never far from his phaser, though even he seemed uncertain whether conventional weapons would be effective against this particular threat. The view screen showed Duke Nukem pacing the transporter room like a caged predator. He'd emptied his magazine into the walls, the console, anywhere that might provide answers or escape routes. The bullets had left small pockmarks in the reinforced walls. Harmless, really, but the gesture itself was telling. This was not a being accustomed to helplessness. "Counselor, what are you sensing?" Picard asked quietly. Troy's dark eyes remained fixed on the screen. Her hand rose to her temple, a gesture Picard had seen countless times when she was processing strong emotional imprints. Anger. Confusion. A deep, primal certainty that he's in mortal danger. But underneath that, she paused, something else. Resignation, maybe. Or experience. He's been trapped before. He's been in impossible situations. And he's survived them. That's not particularly reassuring, Picard said. No, Troy agreed. It's not. Worf leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing. He fights without fear. His weapon was primitive, but his tactical instinct was immediate. He identified the threat, eliminated the control systems, and established a defensive position. That is not the behavior of a common criminal or soldier. That is the behavior of a warrior. A warrior from Earth's 20th century, Data interjected from the doorway, holding a PADD. The android's expression was characteristically neutral, but there was something in his tone that suggested genuine fascination. "Captain, I have compiled preliminary findings from the genetic analysis. The individual's DNA is 94% human. However, the remaining 6% contains genetic markers that do not match any known human subspecies or modification protocol. His cellular structure shows evidence of extreme enhancement, muscle density increased by 300%, bone density augmented to near titanium levels, and a regenerative factor that rivals Klingon physiology. His metabolism operates at approximately 4 times normal human efficiency." "Meaning?" Picard prompted. "Meaning," Data continued, "he possesses strength, durability, and healing capabilities far beyond normal human parameters. However, the chronoton radiation exposure is degrading his cellular cohesion. His regenerative factor is struggling to repair damage faster than the radiation can inflict it. At current exposure rates, he will experience systemic failure within 72 hours unless we can neutralize the chronoton particles." Picard absorbed this information with the gravity it deserved. "And if we attempt to remove him from the containment field? The transporter system would require recalibration. Any attempt to rematerialize him without proper accounting for the chronoton radiation could result in molecular destabilization. He would likely be killed instantly." "So we're trapped with him," Worf said flatly. In a manner of speaking, Data agreed. On the view screen, Duke Nukem had stopped pacing. He was studying the containment field itself now, examining where the energy barrier met the walls, probing with his hand to feel its limits. When his fingers touched the barrier, they sizzled. The pain must have been considerable, but he didn't flinch. He simply withdrew his hand and continued studying. "Open a channel," Picard commanded. "Let's attempt communication." The comm crackled to life. Picard's voice filled Transporter Room 3, calm and measured. "This is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. You are aboard a vessel of the United Federation of Planets. We mean you no harm. I would like to discuss your situation and how we might resolve this incident peacefully." Duke Nukem's head snapped toward the communication grid. His expression twisted into something between a snarl and a grin. "Picard, huh? Well, Captain, Duke Nukem appreciates the formal greeting, but let's cut the bull. I don't know how I got here. I don't know what kind of alien freaks you are. And I sure as hell don't trust any of you. So here's the deal, you let me out of this force field, you tell me where I am and how to get back to Earth, and maybe, I don't tear this tin can of a ship apart." Picard's expression didn't change, but Worf made a subtle sound that might have been a snort of respect or amusement. "Mr. Nukem, I understand you're disoriented. What we're dealing with appears to be a temporal and dimensional anomaly. You may have been displaced through. Displaced? Duke interrupted. Captain, I was fighting the hive mind in Las Vegas. I was in the middle of the biggest battle of my life. 1 second, I'm blasting alien scum, and the next, I'm getting scraped off some kind of cosmic treadmill and deposited in your little light show. So unless you can explain what happened in the next 30 seconds, we're going to have a problem. Troy stepped forward, closer to the screen. Mr. Nukem, I'm Counselor Deanna Troy. I'm an empath. I can sense that you've experienced severe trauma. Whatever just happened to you. An empath? Duke laughed. It was a harsh, bitter sound. Lady, I don't need someone reading my feelings. I'm terrified. I'm angry. And I'm tired of being jerked around. That's my emotional profile. Now, are we going to solve this, or are we going to keep playing games? Picard made a decision. Mr. Nukem, we are currently experiencing a chronoton particle contamination event as a result of your arrival. That contamination is spreading through my ship's systems. We need to work together to contain it and find a way to safely extract you from that room without causing further damage. If you continue to resist and create additional disturbances, you will accelerate your own cellular degradation due to the radiation exposure. There was a pause. Duke's expression shifted, not quite acceptance, but recognition. He was a survivor, and survivors understood cause and effect. How long do I have? He asked. 72 hours, Data said. Possibly less, depending on the rate of degradation. Duke nodded slowly, processing this. And if you get me out of this room, you can stop the radiation? We're working on containment protocols now. Geordi's voice came through the comm. The engineer sounded harried but determined. If we can isolate the chronoton particles in a designated section of the ship, we might be able to siphon them out through the waste management system. But it's going to take time, and we need you to not destroy any more of my equipment. No promises, Duke said, but something in his tone had shifted. The immediate threat of cooperation was now on the table. So what do you want from me? Information, Picard said. We need to understand where you're from, what your last memory was before your arrival, and anything that might help us explain the temporal and dimensional signature we detected. In exchange, we will provide medical treatment for your radiation exposure and work toward a solution that might allow you to return home. Duke considered this. His hand, still bearing the marks of the containment field barrier, flexed as he thought. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, still aggressive, but more controlled. All right, Captain. Let's talk. But I've got one condition. Which is, I want to see this ship. I want to see who and what I'm dealing with. No more talking through speakers. Face to face. You bring one person, your choice, and we have a real conversation. Because right now, I'm looking at a room full of aliens claiming they want to help, and in my experience, help usually comes with a price. Worf turned to Picard. Captain, allowing him out of containment is dangerous. I'm aware, Commander, Picard said. But he's right about one thing. We need information, and he's far more likely to cooperate if we demonstrate good faith. He paused, making a decision. Counselor Troy, you're with me. We'll meet him in a neutral location. Somewhere with exits we control. The holodeck, Troy suggested. We can create an environment that's neutral, not a Federation space, but not a containment cell either. It might put him at ease. Agreed. Stand by. 10 minutes later, Duke Nukem walked out of Transporter Room 3. The containment field had been lowered just enough to allow him to pass through, a symbolic gesture, perhaps, but an important one. Picard and Troy waited for him in Holodeck 2, standing in a recreation of Earth, but not the Earth Duke knew. It was San Francisco, circa 2364. The Golden Gate Bridge gleamed in simulated sunlight. The smell of the Bay air was rendered with meticulous accuracy. And the city around them was peaceful, prosperous, untouched by the wars and aliens and chaos that Duke had spent his life fighting against. Duke stepped out of the holodeck entrance and froze. His eyes, wild and dangerous moments before, suddenly looked almost lost. "What year is it?" he asked quietly. 2364, Picard said. Stardate 41153.7. Duke's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of finality. "Captain, I was born in 1964. I spent the last 40 years, fighting for my life on Earth. And if your sensors are reading that right." He looked at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "Then I've just aged 300 years in a single second." The implications hung in the air between them. Duke Nukem wasn't just displaced. He wasn't just contaminated. He was a man stolen from his own time, forced into a future where everything he knew was dust, where everyone he'd ever known was dead for centuries, where his enemies had become legend and his world had evolved into something almost unrecognizable. And the Federation had no idea how he'd gotten there, or if they could send him back. Dr. Beverly Crusher's medical bay became a cathedral of confusion over the next 8 hours. The sickbay's biometric sensors, state-of-the-art technology that could diagnose diseases light years in advance and synthesize cures from pure mathematics, were fundamentally incapable of understanding what they were looking at. Duke Nukem lay on the primary diagnostic bed, his massive frame almost comical in its oversized muscularity compared to the standard medical equipment. But the real problem wasn't his size. It was everything his cells were telling her systems, and everything they weren't. "His genetic structure is degrading at a rate of 0.03% per hour, Crusher said, her fingers dancing across the holographic display that hovered above Duke's prone form. Data stood beside her, processing the data stream in real time, his positronic brain working through calculations at speeds that would have made conventional doctors obsolete decades ago. "The chronoton radiation is integrating itself into his cellular matrix," Data observed, tilting his head in that characteristic gesture he made when confronted with biological puzzles. "It's not merely damaging his cells, it's becoming part of them. The regenerative factor is attempting to repair the damage, but in doing so, it's incorporating the radiation into the repair mechanisms themselves. A cycle of decay and attempted restoration that perpetuates the very contamination we're trying to eliminate." Crusher looked up from the display, her green eyes carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting an unwinnable battle. "In simpler terms, his own healing factor is making the problem worse. It's like his body is trying to adapt to the chronoton particles by absorbing them, but that absorption is accelerating the decay. We could sedate him, slow his metabolism to halt the regenerative process, but that would also leave him vulnerable to the radiation damage itself." On the bed, Duke's eyes opened. Even in sedation, even with his body being slowly consumed from the inside out by temporal particles, there was still fire in those eyes. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough. 72 hours was an estimate based on standard human physiology, Crusher said gently. "But your physiology isn't standard. Your regenerative factor might extend that. Or it might accelerate your decline. We simply don't have enough data." Duke nodded slowly, absorbing this information with the grim acceptance of a soldier who understood the mathematics of mortality. "So I'm a walking temporal bomb. Great. That's just, great." He tried to laugh, but it came out as a cough that rattled in his chest. When he removed his hand, there was blood on his palm. Chronoton-tainted blood, glowing faintly with the sickly green luminescence of temporal radiation. "Your lungs are beginning to show signs of degradation," Data noted clinically. "The radiation is penetrating deeper into your organ systems. Captain Picard has authorized emergency research protocols. We are attempting to synthesize a chronoton-neutralizing compound, but the theoretical framework is incomplete. We do not yet know what would neutralize this specific radiation without causing additional damage. So I'm also a puzzle you can't solve, Duke said. He sat up slowly, his movements careful, not fearful, but aware. A man who understood pain and worked within its constraints. That's the Federation story, isn't it? We're explorers, we're scientists, we'll figure it out. But you can't. Not this time. Crusher and Data exchanged a glance. It was a human look on Data's face, or as close as his positronic programming could approximate one. Frustration. Humility. The recognition that the universe sometimes didn't follow the rules they'd spent their entire careers learning. No, Crusher admitted. Not yet. But we're not going to stop trying. Duke stood, his legs steady despite everything his body was telling him. He walked to the viewport that looked out on the stars, the same stars he'd seen from Earth, but contextualized differently now. He'd always thought of space as the enemy's domain. A vacuum filled with aliens determined to destroy humanity. But looking at it now, through the Enterprise's viewport, with the gentle curve of some distant planet visible at the edge of the frame, he saw it differently. It was beautiful. And it terrified him. Tell me about the radiation, he said quietly. Not the medical babble. The reality. What am I dealing with here? Data stepped forward, recognizing that Duke's question was a request for clarity, not bedside manner. Chronoton particles are subatomic particles that exist outside normal temporal progression. They are typically found in temporal anomalies or devices designed to manipulate time itself. In your case, the particles were exposed to your genetic structure during a dimensional transposition event. The irregular quantum signature of the dimensional rift caused the chronoton particles to bond with your biological framework in an unprecedented manner. Which means, Data continued, that your body is currently aging and degenerating simultaneously. Your cellular regeneration is attempting to repair damage that exists across multiple temporal states. Your cells are trying to exist in the past, present, and future at the same time. The conflict between these states is causing the degradation Crusher detected. Duke was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned back to face them, and there was something different in his expression. Not acceptance, exactly. But understanding. Recognition. I've been in worse spots, he said finally. I've fought things that defied explanation. I've survived situations that should have killed me a dozen times over. So here's what we're going to do. You keep working on your chronoton neutralizing compound. I'm going to rest, recover as much as I can, and when I'm ready, we're going to figure out what that dimensional rift was and how it happened. Because if something brought me here, maybe it can send me back. That's a logical hypothesis, Data agreed. However, the dimensional rift collapsed after your arrival. We have no record of its parameters or origin signature. Reconstruction would require. Data, Duke interrupted, not unkindly, I get it. It's impossible. Everything about this is impossible. But I've learned one thing in my 300 years of living. Impossible is just another word for not yet. He paused. Or, hasn't been attempted by the right maniac yet. I'm betting that's the real answer. By hour 28 of Duke's arrival, the Enterprise D was a ship divided by interpretation. Picard's senior staff had split into two camps, though they'd never voice it that way in an official capacity. In engineering, Geordi LaForge and his team were attacking the chronoton contamination with pure determination, treating it as a technical puzzle to be solved rather than a biological impossibility. They'd managed to contain 70% of the particle spread by redirecting the contamination through isolated sections of the ship and routing it toward the waste management systems. But that final 30% was resistant. It clung to biological systems, to organic compounds, adapting and persisting in ways that defied standard decontamination protocols. In the captain's ready room, Picard sat across from Worf, reviewing reports that painted a very different picture. Klingon intelligence reports indicate that the Romulans have detected the Chronoton anomaly, Worf said, his voice carrying the particular weight of strategic danger. They are requesting coordinates and information about the incident. The message was cryptic, but the implication is clear: they're interested in the source of the temporal radiation. Of course they are, Picard said quietly. A temporal anomaly is exactly the kind of thing Section 31 would weaponize, and the Romulans are always looking for leverage. He stood, moving to the viewport that showed the stars beyond. Worf, what do you make of our guest? Worf considered the question carefully. He is dangerous. His combat instincts are sharp, his physical capabilities formidable. But more than that, he is disciplined. Not in the Starfleet sense, but in the warrior sense. He understands hierarchy, strength, and respect through proven competence. If we treat him as a threat without acknowledging his abilities, he will respond with aggression. If we treat him as an asset, he will respond with cooperation. You respect him, Picard observed. I do, Worf admitted. He is what a Klingon might be if our culture valued individual honor above collective conquest. He fights not for glory or empire, but for survival and principle. There is honor in that. Picard nodded slowly. Then we need to be very careful about what happens next. Because if the Romulans or anyone else discover that Duke Nukem is aboard this ship, a being of considerable power and unpredictable allegiances, they won't rest until they've either acquired him or eliminated him as a threat. Hour 36 found Duke in the holodeck once again, but this time by choice. He'd asked Picard to create something specific: Earth. Not future Earth. Not the peaceful San Francisco of the 24th century. The Las Vegas of his time. The neon-soaked, chaotic sprawl of human ambition and decay that he'd known all his life. The holodeck rendered it perfectly. The strip glowed with simulated light. The sound of slot machines and drunk voices filled the air. The smell of cigarette smoke and spilled alcohol hung in the simulation like a ghost of a world that had died 300 years ago. Duke walked through it slowly, taking it in. His hands were steady, but there was something hollow in his eyes. Something that even the violent, aggressive exterior couldn't quite hide. He was a man saying goodbye to a world he'd never see again. Data watched from the observation room, processing Duke's behavior with his characteristic analytical distance. But even Data could recognize what he was observing: grief. The complex, multifaceted emotional response to permanent loss. He's saying goodbye, Troy said, standing beside Data at the window. Her empathic senses were strong enough to penetrate even the holodeck's technological barriers. He knows, on some level, that even if we send him back through time, he can never go home. Everyone he knew is gone. His entire world is dust. The life he's mourning, it's not just behind him. It's impossible to return to. A logical assessment, Data said. However, mourning is an emotional response. Duke's behavior suggests he does not accept logic easily. No, Troy agreed. He doesn't. But that's also what makes him special, Data. He accepts the impossible, processes it, and moves forward. Most people would break. Duke just adapts. It was in that moment, hour 37, that the emergency alert sounded. Not red alert. Not the panic stations that Duke had come to associate with danger. This was different. This was urgent. Picard's voice came through the ship-wide comm: all senior officers report to the bridge immediately. We have a situation developing in the neutral zone. Duke looked up from the simulated Las Vegas he'd been wandering through, his expression shifting instantly from grief to tactical readiness. Whatever was coming, whatever threat had triggered the emergency, his body recognized it as familiar territory. The hunt was beginning again. The neutral zone was called that for a reason: it was supposed to be neutral. A buffer between Federation and Romulan space where neither power held dominion, where encounters were rare and usually carefully orchestrated through diplomatic channels. The Enterprise D had been patrolling the zone for 3 weeks without incident when the subspace readings changed everything. 3 Romulan vessels, closing on our position, Tactical Officer Worf announced, his voice carrying the cold precision of a warrior assessing threat levels. They are not hailing us. They are not transmitting any formal request. They are simply approaching. Picard leaned forward in his command chair, his fingers steepled in that characteristic gesture that meant his mind was already 3 moves ahead of the board. Yellow alert. Raise shields to full power but do not lock weapons. I want to know their intentions before we give them a reason to assume hostile posture. The view screen flickered, and suddenly the 3 Romulan warbuds appeared, sleek, predatory vessels that moved through space with the grace of hunters who had perfected their craft over centuries. The lead ship, a Deridex-class vessel, opened a hailing frequency. The Romulan commander who appeared on screen was exactly what Picard expected. Cold, calculating, with the particular blend of confidence and cunning that marked the Tal Shiar. Federation vessel, this is Commander Vex of the Romulan Star Empire. We are aware that you are harboring an entity of significant strategic interest. We are requesting that you transfer this entity to our custody immediately. Failure to comply will result in military action. Commander, Picard replied, his voice steady despite the tactical nightmare developing around them, I'm not aware of any entity aboard this vessel that would be of interest to the Romulan Star Empire. Perhaps you could clarify. Do not attempt deception, Captain, Vex snarled. Our sensors detected a temporal anomaly in this sector approximately 37 hours ago. The energy signature was consistent with dimensional breach technology. We know something came through that breach. And we know your ship was in proximity to the event. Transfer it to us, or we will take it by force. Before Picard could respond, a new voice cut through the comm system, one that didn't originate from the Romulan ships. Yeah, that's not happening, pal. Duke Nukem stood on the bridge, having apparently ignored every protocol about restricted areas and command procedures. He was still weakened from the Chronoton exposure, but he moved with the confident stride of a man who had made his peace with impossible odds. Worf's hand immediately went to his phaser, but Picard raised a hand, stopping him. Whatever was about to happen, shutting Duke down would only complicate the situation further. This is Duke Nukem, Duke said, addressing the view screen directly. And I've got a message for your boss back in Romulan space. I'm not interested in your empire, your wars, or your politics. I don't know who you are, I don't care what you want, and I'm definitely not going anywhere with you. So here's my counter-offer, you turn those ships around and get out of Federation space, or I'm going to come over there and personally demonstrate why that would be a mistake. The bridge fell silent. Picard's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching admiration. Data's optical sensors flickered, processing the tactical ramifications of Duke's unsanctioned communication. Worf's lips curved into what might have been a smile. Commander Vex's expression on the view screen remained cold, but something shifted in his eyes. Calculation. Reassessment. This is the entity we detected. Fascinating. It appears to be human. Enhanced, certainly, but fundamentally biological. They're all along. Mr. Nukem, Picard said quietly, while I appreciate your contribution to our immediate tactical situation, I would remind you that there are protocols aboard a starship. A chain of command. Procedures that exist for reasons. Duke shrugged. Captain, I get it. You've got rules, regulations, procedures. That's fine for peacetime and routine operations. But those 3 ships coming at us. That wasn't a routine situation. And in situations like that, you don't have time for bureaucracy. You identify the threat, you assess the response, and you act. Everything else is secondary. That, Worf said, standing and turning to face Duke directly, is the way a warrior thinks. There was something in that statement, not hostile, but challenging. Worf was a Klingon officer serving in Starfleet, a man caught between two cultures, two codes of honor. And he was recognizing something in Duke that resonated with the warrior culture he'd never fully abandoned. Duke met Worf's gaze directly. There was mutual respect there, instant and unspoken. Two men who understood violence, honor, and the cost of survival. Two men from different species, different eras, different cultures, but united in a philosophy that transcended Federation regulations. "You've got good instincts, Commander," Duke said. "In another life, another war, we could probably work well together. In this life, this war," Worf replied, "we may need to." Picard recognized the moment for what it was, the beginning of an alliance between two warriors that operated on principles he understood intellectually but would never fully embrace. It was dangerous. It was unpredictable. And it might be exactly what they would need in the coming days. "Dr. Crusher," Picard said, his attention returning to the immediate medical problem, "how is the chronoton degradation progressing?" "Accelerating," came the response through the comm. "The confrontation with the Romulans seems to have elevated his adrenaline and cortisol levels, which is paradoxically slowing the degradation in his muscle tissue while accelerating it in his organ systems. He's got maybe 48 hours now instead of 72. The stress is making his condition worse, not better." Duke nodded, accepting this information with the grim acknowledgement of a man whose body was a battlefield. "So I need to stay calm and relaxed. That's not really my style, Doctor." "I'm aware," Crusher said. "Which is why I'm increasing your sedative regimen. You need rest, and you need your body to slow its regenerative process." "Sedatives won't help," Duke said flatly. "I need action. I need to be doing something. That's how I operate. Keeping me calm is like asking a warp engine to run in neutral, theoretically possible, but you're fighting against fundamental design principles." Data's optical sensors brightened as he processed this statement. "An interesting metaphor, Mr. Nukem. However, your comparison raises a logical point. A warp engine running in neutral is still a warp engine. Its fundamental nature does not change simply because it is not currently operating at full capacity. Perhaps your regenerative factor operates similarly, it remains functional even if your conscious mind is sedated." "Maybe," Duke conceded. "But I'd rather test that hypothesis when we're not running out of time." Worf stepped forward. "Captain, I would like to request permission to work with Mr. Nukem on hand-to-hand combat simulations. If the Romulans are planning to return, and Commander Vex's final statement suggested they are, we should be prepared for their next approach. Mr. Nukem's combat experience could be valuable in developing defensive strategies." It was a clever request, Picard realized. Worf was offering Duke a way to remain active, to stay engaged, without putting him in direct danger. And in the process, Worf was also demonstrating the kind of strategic thinking that made him invaluable to the Enterprise. "Approved," Picard said. "But Dr. Crusher will monitor his condition throughout. If his vitals show signs of critical degradation, we stop immediately." "Understood," Crusher acknowledged. Duke smiled for the first time since arriving aboard the Enterprise. It was a smile that carried the promise of violence and the joy of finally being understood. "All right, Commander Worf. Let's see if a Federation warrior can keep up with someone who's been fighting for his life since before your empire existed." "I look forward to discovering that answer," Worf replied. As the two warriors moved toward the turbolift, Picard exchanged a look with Data. The android's expression was characteristically neutral, but there was something in his optical sensors that suggested he, too, understood what was happening. The Federation had just acquired something it had never truly contended with before, a warrior who didn't operate by the rules of logic or diplomacy. A being whose very existence challenged the fundamental principles that Starfleet was built upon. And the Romulans, it seemed, were willing to commit resources to acquiring him, or eliminating him as a threat. The game was changing. And on the bridge of the Enterprise D, as the stars continued their eternal dance in the void of space, Picard understood that the most dangerous game of all was about to begin. The holodeck recreation of a Klingon training ground was almost perfect in its brutality. Rock formations jutted from the simulated Earth at jagged angles. The sky above was perpetually stormy, with thunder that wasn't just visual but tactile, vibrations through the deck plating that made every confrontation feel like a battle against nature itself. Worf had insisted on the authentic setting. Duke had simply nodded and removed his shirt. For 6 hours, they trained. Not sparring in the traditional sense, but testing each other's capabilities against a series of progressively complex combat scenarios. Worf fought with the precision of someone trained in Starfleet martial protocols combined with raw Klingon brutality. Duke fought with the instinctive lethality of someone who'd spent decades in actual combat situations where mistakes meant death. By the end of the 6th hour, both warriors were breathing hard. Worf had bruises that would take days to fade. Duke's chronotin-tainted blood was beginning to show at the corners of his mouth, a sign that the exertion was accelerating the cellular degradation. "You are weakening," Worf observed, not as an insult but as a tactical assessment. "Yeah," Duke admitted. "The radiation's getting worse. Every time I push hard, it accelerates the damage. It's a trade-off. I can stay rested and degraded, or I can stay active and degrade faster. Either way, the clock's ticking." "Then we should maximize what time remains," Worf said. He extended his hand to help Duke to his feet. It was a gesture of mutual respect, a warrior acknowledging another warrior's strength despite the circumstances. There is a Klingon saying, "A warrior does not measure his life in years, but in glorious moments." One perfect battle is worth 10,000 years of mediocrity. Duke clasped Worf's forearm in the traditional Klingon gesture. "I like that philosophy better than Federation optimism. At least it's honest about the cost of living." They exited the holodeck together, moving through the Enterprise's corridors with the easy confidence of men who understood violence and had made peace with their place in the universe. But as they walked, Worf's expression shifted into something more serious. "There is something you should know," Worf said quietly. "The Romulans will return." Commander Vex was not bluffing. "And when they do, they will come prepared for direct confrontation. The Tal Shiar does not take rejection lightly." "Yeah, I figured that," Duke said. "The question is, what do they actually want? Me? My DNA? Some secret I'm carrying? There's always a reason for this kind of pursuit, and it's never just because we feel like it." "That is the question Captain Picard has been asking," Worf replied. "The answer, we believe, is more complicated than simple acquisition. The Romulan Star Empire has been experimenting with temporal technology for decades. Your arrival in a dimensional rift suggests that someone, somewhere, may have been experimenting with technology we don't yet understand. If the Romulans can reverse engineer the process that brought you here, they could potentially weaponize temporal manipulation. You would simply be a proof of concept." Duke nodded slowly. "So I'm not valuable for what I am. I'm valuable for what I represent, the possibility that temporal weapons are achievable. And if they capture me, they can study my biology, learn how dimensional rifts work, and build their own weapons." "Precisely," Worf confirmed. They reached the turbolift. As the doors hissed open, Duke turned to Worf. "Then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance. Because if there's one thing I understand, it's that weapons in the hands of the wrong people end badly for everyone." Meanwhile, in the captain's ready room, Picard was reviewing classified intelligence reports that had been transmitted from Starfleet Command. What he was reading troubled him in ways that transcended the immediate. Tactical situation. The Tal Shiar has been actively recruiting scientific specialists for something called Project Kronos for the past 18 months, Picard said, reading from the report displayed on his PADD. They've diverted significant resources toward temporal mechanics research. But here's the concern, 3 of the scientists recruited for this project were Federation researchers who went dark, disappeared during routine assignments and resurfaced months later working for the Romulans. Data processed this information with his characteristic analytical precision. The implication is that the Tal Shiar has achieved a level of temporal technology that exceeds our understanding. If they have successfully created a device capable of dimensional transposition, then Mr. Nukem's arrival may not have been accidental. That's what I'm afraid of, Picard said. He stood, moving to the viewport where the stars continued their infinite procession. What if Duke Nukem wasn't accidentally transported here? What if the Romulans deliberately created the dimensional rift in an attempt to summon something powerful? What if they were testing their technology by trying to pull something from another dimension? Then Mr. Nukem would be a success, Data said. And they would be motivated to repeat the experiment, potentially bringing through multiple entities. And the Federation would be facing an enemy it cannot comprehend using weapons it cannot defend against, Picard finished. The doors to the ready room hissed open. Counselor Troy entered, her expression grave. Captain, I've been reviewing the empathic data we collected from Duke's arrival. There's something you need to know. When Duke first materialized, I sensed more than just his emotions. I sensed echoes. Impressions from other minds. Other beings. It's faint, almost subliminal, but it's there. Other beings? Picard asked. Yes, Troy confirmed. I believe there may have been other entities that attempted to cross the dimensional threshold at the same moment Duke did. But they didn't make it through. Their consciousness signatures are still caught in the dimensional rift itself, trapped between realities. Picard felt the weight of that realization settle on him. You're suggesting that the dimensional rift didn't just transport Duke. It killed other beings in the process. Or trapped them, Troy said quietly. Either way, if the Romulans are responsible for this technology, they've created something far more dangerous than anyone realized. They've created a weapon that doesn't just kill, it removes beings from existence entirely, trapping them in the space between realities. Data tilted his head in that characteristic manner. An important distinction, Counselor. If the technology simply removes matter from our dimension, then theoretically, those trapped entities might be recoverable. However, the entropy involved in maintaining a stable dimensional aperture would require enormous energy expenditure. The Romulan vessel we encountered would not possess sufficient power reserves to maintain such a rift for extended periods. Which means, Picard said slowly, that they've been practicing with smaller rifts, perfecting the technology before attempting something larger. And Duke's arrival suggests they may have finally succeeded in creating a stable breach point. Captain, Data continued, there is another possibility. If the Tal Shiar has achieved stable dimensional bridging technology, they may not be interested in Duke specifically. They may be interested in what he represents, proof that the technology works. The logical next step would be to use it to acquire assets of greater strategic value. Such as? Picard prompted, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The Borg, Data said. If the Romulans could isolate a Borg drone or assimilation vessel and transport it across dimensional boundaries, they could study Borg technology without direct confrontation. Similarly, they could potentially transport Dominion assets from the Gamma Quadrant. Or, Data paused, his optical sensors brightening as he processed the full scope of the threat, they could transport beings that don't currently exist in our dimension at all. Bringing through creatures or entities that we have no defense against. The implications hung in the air like a blade suspended above them all. Picard moved back to his desk, his mind already working through contingencies and strategies. We need to find out if the Romulans deliberately created that rift, Picard said. And if they did, we need to find their temporal technology facility and shut it down before they can conduct another experiment. Data, I want you to work with Geordi on analyzing the chronoton particle signature. See if we can reverse engineer the dimensional transposition technology from the radiation alone. An ambitious goal, Captain, Data replied. The theoretical framework is incomplete, but I will allocate maximum computational resources. And Counselor, Picard continued, I want you to maintain regular empathic contact with Duke. We need to understand if there are other consciousnesses still attempting to breach the dimensional barrier. If there are, and if the Romulans bring through something hostile, we need to know before it arrives. Troy nodded. I'll begin sessions with him immediately after his training with Worf concludes. As they filed out of the ready room, Picard remained at his desk, staring at the classified reports that painted a picture of an enemy developing weapons that transcended conventional warfare. The Federation had faced many threats, the Borg, the Dominion, hostile species beyond counting. But temporal weapons represented something fundamentally different. They didn't just threaten ships or stations or lives. They threatened the very fabric of reality itself. And somewhere in Romulan space, behind cloaking shields and in hidden research facilities, scientists were perfecting the technology that could bring that threat to fruition. 42 hours into Duke's arrival, the Enterprise detected the subspace message. Not a hail, a transmission. Coded in Federation protocols but with a Romulan signature embedded underneath. It took data less than 30 seconds to decode it. The message was simple, direct, and terrifying. Enterprise D, this is the Tal Shir Science Directorate. We are transmitting this message to inform you that we have successfully replicated the dimensional transposition technology that brought your current passenger to your vessel. In 72 hours, we will initiate a controlled breach at coordinates XYZ in the neutral zone. We are bringing through an entity of significant strategic value. You have 3 options. Transfer Duke Nukem to us before the breach occurs, evacuate the area and allow us to proceed unimpeded, or remain and face the consequences of interference. The choice is yours, Captain. But choose wisely. What comes through the rift will make Duke Nukem look like a child. The message ended. But the threat remained, hanging over the Enterprise like a storm cloud, pregnant with catastrophic potential. Picard stood in the center of the bridge, his expression calm on the surface but his mind racing through impossibilities and worst-case scenarios. The Romulans weren't bluffing. And in 72 hours, they would either surrender Duke, abandon the sector, or face an enemy they couldn't comprehend. It was, in every way that mattered, impossible. But Picard had learned long ago that impossible was simply another word for not yet solved. The question was whether they had time enough to find the solution. The enslaved world was called Theta Prime, a designation rather than a name, which was appropriate given that its inhabitants had long ago forgotten any names their ancestors might have given it. The colony had been subjugated by the Cardassian Union 3 decades prior, integrated into their occupation infrastructure, and left to labor in dilithium mines that fed the war machine of an expanding empire. Captain Picard had not chosen to visit Theta Prime. The Enterprise had been diverted there by a Priority 1 distress beacon, the kind that overrode normal protocols and demanded immediate investigation. It was a trap, of sorts, not a military one, but a moral one. And Picard understood traps. He'd learned to recognize them the way a hunter recognizes snares. What he hadn't anticipated was Duke's response. The away team consisted of Picard, Worf, Riker. The Enterprise's first officer who had been recovering from a shoulder injury and was eager to get back into active duty, and Duke. Crusher had opposed Duke's participation with the particular vehemence of a doctor watching her patient accelerate his own decline. His chronotin degradation was now critical, he had perhaps 36 hours of functional time remaining. But Duke had insisted, and Picard, understanding the psychology of warriors, had allowed it. The mines of Theta Prime were a vision of industrial hell. The Cardassians had stripped the planet's crust, leaving enormous excavations that descended kilometers into the earth. The enslaved workers, a mixture of species, all bearing the hollow eyes of those who had surrendered hope, labored without rest in conditions that would have been considered violations of Federation humanitarian law if anyone with power cared enough to enforce them. "My God," Riker whispered as they materialized near the main processing facility. "How is this still happening?" How has no one done anything about this? The enslaved world was called Theta Prime, a designation rather than a name, which was appropriate given that its inhabitants had long ago forgotten any names their ancestors might have given it. The colony had been subjugated by the Cardassian Union 3 decades prior, integrated into their occupation infrastructure, and left to labor in dilithium mines that fed the war machine of an expanding empire. Captain Picard had not chosen to visit Theta Prime. The Enterprise had been diverted there by a Priority 1 distress beacon, the kind that overrode normal protocols and demanded immediate investigation. It was a trap, of sorts, not a military one, but a moral one. And Picard understood traps. He'd learned to recognize them the way a hunter recognizes snares. What he hadn't anticipated was Duke's response. The away team consisted of Picard, Worf, Riker. The Enterprise's first officer who had been recovering from a shoulder injury and was eager to get back into active duty, and Duke. Crusher had opposed Duke's participation with the particular vehemence of a doctor watching her patient accelerate his own decline. His chronotin degradation was now critical, he had perhaps 36 hours of functional time remaining. But Duke had insisted, and Picard, understanding the psychology of warriors, had allowed it. The mines of Theta Prime were a vision of industrial hell. The Cardassians had stripped the planet's crust, leaving enormous excavations that descended kilometers into the earth. The enslaved workers, a mixture of species, all bearing the hollow eyes of those who had surrendered hope, labored without rest in conditions that would have been considered violations of Federation humanitarian law if anyone with power cared enough to enforce them. "My God," Riker whispered as they materialized near the main processing facility. "How is this still happening? How has no one done anything about this?" In the conflict that followed. "And how many die if we do nothing?" Duke demanded. It was a valid question. Perhaps the most valid question that could be asked in the context of the Prime Directive. And Picard had no answer that would satisfy a warrior who measured morality in lives saved rather than principles maintained. They proceeded deeper into the mine complex, moving with tactical precision. Worf was in front, his phaser set to stun, his Klingon warrior instincts guiding them through the Cardassian patrol patterns. Behind him came Picard, then Riker, with Duke bringing up the rear, though rear was a misleading term for someone who moved with the awareness that suggested he was simultaneously assessing threats in all directions. The enslaved workers ignored them at first, too exhausted to register the presence of Starfleet uniforms. But when the Cardassian guards began to react, when weapons were raised and orders were being shouted, something shifted in Duke's expression. His hand went to the phaser at his hip, but Picard held up a hand. "No weapons," Picard commanded. "We don't shoot. That's an order." "Those guards are about to shoot us," Duke pointed out. "Yes," Picard said. "But they're going to stun us, not kill us. The Cardassians want prisoners, not corpses. We'll be taken into custody, and that will give us time to gather intelligence and plan an escape. If we begin firing, the situation escalates beyond our control." Duke's expression suggested he thought Picard was insane. But he didn't draw his weapon. The Cardassian guards advanced, their plasma rifles raised. There was a moment of tension, a heartbeat where the situation could have gone either direction. Then Worf deactivated his phaser and placed it on the ground. One by one, the Enterprise officers did the same. Duke was the last. He stared at his phaser for a long moment, his hand hovering over it as if he couldn't quite process the concept of voluntary surrender. Then, with deliberate slowness, he deactivated it and set it on the ground beside the others. "This is a terrible plan," he said to Picard. "Probably," Picard agreed. "But it's the only plan that doesn't result in a Dominion-style conflict that destabilizes the entire sector." The Cardassian guards moved in, weapons raised, and took them into custody. The detention block was austere and efficient, designed for maximum control with minimal resource expenditure. Picard and the others were placed in separate cells, a tactic meant to prevent coordination or rebellion. It was also, Picard understood, a mistake on the Cardassians' part. In his cell, Picard used the time to formulate a plan. Riker, in a cell 2 doors down, was doing the same. Worf, with the patience of a warrior who understood that battles often required waiting, was conserving his energy. And Duke was slowly dying, his chronotin degradation accelerating as stress and confinement pushed his regenerative factor to the breaking point. Picard, Duke's voice came through the cell wall. His Cardassian captors had apparently underestimated human hearing and the ways in which sound could travel through detention block architecture. We need to get out of here. My time's almost up. I can feel it. The radiation's eating me from the inside out. I know, Picard said quietly. I'm working on it. Your plan better involve freeing these people, Duke said. Because if we escape and leave them down here, I'm going to remember that choice every day for however many days I have left. And I'm going to hate you for it. I'm going to hate myself for it. And I'm going to hate this whole, prime directive, concept that lets you sleep at night while people suffer. Picard was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying a weight that suggested a decision had been made. The Cardassian garrison commander is named Gul Macet. He's a career officer with political ambitions. He's brutal, but he's also pragmatic. Which means he has a price. Not latinum, something he values more than credits. Power. Status. The chance to advance his position within the Union hierarchy. How does that help us? Duke asked. It helps, Picard said slowly, if we give him something valuable enough to trade. Something that would make freeing these workers, and allowing us to escape, worth the political risk of openly defying Cardassian occupation protocols. What could possibly be worth that? Riker's voice came through the wall now. Information, Picard said. Federation intelligence about Romulan movements in the sector. Data about a temporal weapons research program that directly threatens Cardassian military dominance. In exchange for that information that would make Gul Macet a hero to the Cardassian military, he could claim that the mine workers were liberated by a Starfleet incursion he was unable to prevent, and he was actually involved in capturing Federation operatives in the process. He maintains his position, potentially advances it, and looks like a competent commander rather than a failure. That's a lie, Duke said bluntly. You'd be lying to him. Yes, Picard agreed. I would. And in doing so, I would violate my own principles. But in exchange for that violation, thousands of lives would be freed. Theta Prime would be liberated. And we would have actually done something rather than hiding behind the Prime Directive. There was a long silence. Then Duke's voice came again, quieter this time. There's a cost, isn't there? There's always a cost. Yes, Picard said. The Cardassians will investigate the information I give them. Some of it will be accurate, enough to make it valuable. But some of it will be misdirection, designed to send their military in directions that actually serve Federation interests. In essence, I'm using the liberation of Theta Prime as cover for a larger intelligence operation. I'm manipulating both the Cardassians and you. I'm making you complicit in a deception, even though your intentions are entirely moral. So the ends justify the means, Duke said. In this case, Picard replied, I'm beginning to think they might. 20 hours later, Theta Prime was being evacuated. The Enterprise, positioned in high orbit with shields raised and weapons armed, was transporting the enslaved workers directly to a Federation-aligned neutral colony where they could begin their lives anew. The Cardassian garrison, equipped with false intelligence about Romulan movements and convinced that Gul Macet had successfully defended Federation incursion attempts, was allowing it to happen. On the bridge of the Enterprise, Picard watched the evacuation proceed with the careful attention of a commander who understood the consequences of his actions. He had violated the Prime Directive. He had manipulated the Cardassian military. He had allowed political pragmatism to override the pure application of principle. And he had freed thousands of people from slavery. Duke was in sickbay, his chronoton degradation now critical. Crusher had given him perhaps 12 hours remaining. His body was actively shutting down as the temporal radiation consumed his cellular structure at an accelerating rate. He should have been resting. Instead, he was watching the evacuation through a viewport, seeing the enslaved workers emerge into freedom. "You did it," Troy said, standing beside him. Her empathic senses were picking up the complex tangle of emotions radiating from Duke: satisfaction, exhaustion, and underneath it all, the particular piece of a man who had finally been part of something that mattered. "Picard did it," Duke corrected. "I just pointed out that your rules were wrong." "No," Troy said. "You did more than that. You reminded the captain that the Prime Directive, like all laws, is ultimately a framework for human decision-making. It can be applied rigidly or flexibly, depending on the circumstances. You reminded him that principles without compassion become cruelty. And you showed him that sometimes, the greatest morality lies in breaking your own rules for the right reasons." Duke nodded slowly. "That's a nice way of saying I made him violate his own principles." "Yes," Troy agreed. "But in doing so, you expanded those principles. You made them more human. More flexible. More capable of responding to real suffering rather than abstract doctrine." On the view screen, the last transport lifted off from Theta Prime. The Cardassian garrison was retreating, moving away from the mining complex they'd maintained for 3 decades. The planet itself, stripped bare, scarred by industrial exploitation, would take generations to recover. But it was free now. And freedom, Duke understood, was the first step toward healing. His body, however, was past the point of healing. The chronoton radiation had consumed approximately 80% of his cellular structure. His regenerative factor was still fighting, still trying to repair the damage, but it was a battle he was losing. He had perhaps 6 hours remaining. Maybe less. "I need to talk to Picard," Duke said quietly. "I'll get him," Troy said. When Picard arrived in sickbay, Duke was standing at the viewport, looking out at the stars with the particular intensity of someone saying goodbye. The captain stood beside him, not speaking, simply being present. "You broke your own rule," Duke said finally. "Your Prime Directive." "I did," Picard agreed. "And I would do it again." "That's growth," Duke said. "That's what I respect about you, Picard. You can change. You can recognize when your principles have failed and adjust accordingly. Most people can't do that. Most people would have let those workers die rather than admit their philosophy was incomplete." "The Prime Directive isn't wrong," Picard said. "But it's not infallible either. And sometimes, the most ethical choice is to recognize that rules are meant to serve humanity, not the other way around." Duke nodded slowly. "You know what I realized down there? In those mines? I realized that I've been fighting my whole life for the wrong reasons. I've been fighting to win. To dominate. To be the strongest, the most powerful, the one who couldn't be beaten. But down there, seeing those people, I understood that the point of power isn't to dominate others. It's to protect them. To use strength to defend the weak. That's what real power is." "That's exactly what Starfleet is supposed to represent," Picard said quietly. "Yeah," Duke replied. "I'm beginning to understand that." His knees buckled. Crusher was there instantly, easing him back into the medical bed. His breathing was becoming labored, his skin taking on a faint luminescence as the chronoton radiation began consuming his external cellular layers. "How long?" Duke asked. 4 hours, Crusher said gently. "Maybe 5. The degradation has accelerated past all projections." "I'm sorry, Duke. We did everything we could." Duke smiled, A real smile, not the aggressive bravado he'd worn since arriving on the Enterprise. "Doc, you're missing the point. I came here from 300 years in my past, fought aliens, met warriors I could respect, and helped free a planet. That's a better ending than most people get. That's a better ending than I expected when I woke up in your transporter room." He looked at Picard. "Thank you. For showing me that my way wasn't the only way. For proving that there's more to power than dominance." "No," Picard said. "Thank you. For reminding me that principles without compassion are hollow. You've changed me too, Duke. And I suspect your presence here will continue to change this crew, this fleet, long after you're gone." Duke closed his eyes, his breathing becoming more shallow. The radiation was consuming him now, pulling him apart at the molecular level. But there was peace in his expression. The peace of a warrior who had finally found something worth dying for. Section 31 operated in the shadows, in the spaces between regulations and necessity, where the Federation's idealistic principles collided with the brutal mathematics of survival. Admiral Sati had been running the organization for 3 years, and in that time, she'd learned that the greatest threats to the Federation weren't always external. Sometimes they were internal, possibilities, potentials, beings who existed in the margins of understanding. Duke Nukem represented exactly that kind of threat. The encrypted subspace message arrived on Picard's personal terminal at 0300 hours ship's time. It was flagged with the highest security clearance, bearing the personal authentication codes of Admiral Sati herself. Picard read it once, then read it again, making sure he understood the implications correctly. "I need you to bring Duke Nukem to Starbase Epsilon 7 for evaluation and containment," the message read. Federation security has determined that the individual represents a potential threat to interstellar stability. His unpredictable behavior, combined with his physical capabilities and apparent disregard for established protocols, makes him a security risk we cannot ignore. Transfer him to our custody within 48 hours, or we will be forced to take more direct action. This is not a request, Captain. This is a directive from the highest levels of Federation authority. Picard sat in his darkened ready room, the glow of the terminal casting shadows across his face. He understood what Section 31 was really saying: we want to study him, contain him, possibly eliminate him if he poses too great a risk. And they had the authority to force the issue. He called an emergency senior staff meeting, but this time he did something he rarely did: he invited Duke. When they were all assembled in the briefing room, Picard presented the situation with clinical precision. Section 31 has ordered us to surrender Duke to their custody. Failure to comply will result in direct intervention by Federation security forces. They're afraid of him, Data said immediately. Section 31 operates on threat assessment protocols. If they believe Duke represents a variable they cannot control, they will move to neutralize him. Which means, Worf added, his hand instinctively moving to his phaser as if he could fight off the entire Section 31 apparatus through sheer force of will, that we have limited options. We can comply, we can resist, or we can find a third path. There is no third path, came a new voice through the comm, not from the briefing room, but from somewhere in the ship's subspace system. A woman's voice, cold and methodical. "Captain Picard, this is Admiral Sati. I'm monitoring this conversation remotely. And I want to be very clear about what's happening here. You have 48 hours to transfer the subject to Epsilon 7. Any resistance will be met with force." The comm cut out. But the threat remained, hanging in the air like radiation. "Captain," Picard's counselor said quietly, "what do you want to do?" Picard looked at Duke. The warrior was sitting calmly, processing the information with the tactical awareness of someone who'd spent his life dealing with impossible situations. There was no panic in his expression, no fear. Just calculation. "They want to lock me up," Duke said finally. "Study me. Figure out what makes me tick and whether I can be weaponized or need to be eliminated." "Yes," Picard confirmed. And you? Duke turned to face Picard directly. What do you want to do? It was the right question. The only question that mattered. Because everything that happened next depended on Picard's answer. I want to protect you, Picard said carefully. But not at the cost of putting my crew in danger or violating my oath as a Starfleet officer. I'm bound by regulations and protocol, and those bonds are important to me. They define who I am. Even when those regulations are wrong? Duke asked. Especially then. Picard replied. Because breaking them for convenience is easy. But breaking them because they're wrong, that requires understanding why they're wrong and being willing to accept the consequences. Worf stood abruptly. Captain, I have a proposal. Section 31 has issued an ultimatum, but they are operating under the assumption that we will comply with Federation authority structures. What if we change the context of the situation? How? Picard asked. We bring the situation before the Federation Council, Worf said. We make it public. We force them to justify their demand for Duke's custody in a forum where public opinion and democratic process have weight. Section 31 operates in the shadows because sunlight is their enemy. If we expose their actions, force them to act openly, they lose their advantage. They'll simply deny everything, Data pointed out. Section 31's operational protocols are designed to prevent documented proof of their actions. But they won't deny that they want Duke, Worf countered. If we frame the conversation correctly, if we make it about the right of the Federation to detain an individual without trial, without due process, without public oversight, we can force a confrontation between Section 31's authority and Federation constitutional principles. Picard felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. Worf was right. This wasn't really about Duke at all. It was about the Federation's fundamental values being tested against the practical necessities of security. You're suggesting we use the democratic process as a weapon, Picard said slowly. I am suggesting, Worf replied, that we remind the Federation what it claims to stand for. The subspace transmission reached the Federation Council in San Francisco within the hour. Picard had recorded a personal message, explaining the situation, requesting an emergency session to discuss the legality and ethics of Section 31's demand. He hadn't been subtle about it. He'd made it clear that a being was being threatened with indefinite detention without trial, without representation, without any of the legal protections the Federation claimed to guarantee its members. The response came faster than he expected. An emergency session was scheduled for 18 hours hence. Section 31 would be asked to justify their demand before the full council. Public opinion, already volatile due to the growing awareness of Section 31's existence and methods, began to crystallize around the question, did the Federation really stand for the ideals it proclaimed, or was it willing to sacrifice those ideals for the comfort of security? But in the interim, the Romulan threat continued to advance. Picard received a new message from Romulan Commander Vex: your internal conflicts are irrelevant to us, Federation. In 24 hours, we will open the dimensional rift. We will bring through the entity we have selected. And it will end your empire's expansion into the stars. Prepare yourselves for the arrival of something beyond your comprehension. The message included data packets, sensor readings, energy signatures, partial images captured through the dimensional barrier. What Picard saw made his blood run cold. The creature was massive. Partially organic, partially cybernetic, with an appearance that suggested both intelligence and absolute predatory purpose. Its energy signature was unlike anything in Federation records. It dwarfed the Borg in sheer power output. It made the Dominion's Jem'Hadar look like children playing soldier. Analysis, Picard commanded, his voice steady despite the horror he was witnessing. Data's optical sensors fluctuated as he processed the data. The energy signatures suggest a being of equivalent or superior technological capability to the Borg collective. However, the biological components indicate an entirely different evolutionary pathway. This creature does not appear to be part of any known species or collective in the Alpha Quadrant. Which means? Picard prompted. Which means, Data continued, the Romulans have brought through something from another dimension entirely. A being that has never encountered Federation technology, Federation diplomacy, or any of our defensive protocols. It is, in every meaningful sense, a completely unknown threat. Geordi LaForge's voice came through the comm from engineering. Captain, if that thing comes through and starts firing, our shields won't hold against power outputs like that. We're looking at maybe 3 minutes before the Enterprise is disabled. Maybe less. Can we evacuate? Picard asked. Not all of us, Crusher replied. Transporter capacity is limited. We could save maybe 60% of the crew before the power systems fail. Picard closed his eyes briefly. The mathematics of mortality. The calculus of who lives and who dies. This was the cost of command, not just tactical decisions, but the knowledge that your choices would determine which of your crew survived and which wouldn't. Duke entered the ready room without knocking, a habit he'd developed that no longer bothered Picard. The warrior was moving slower now, the chronoton radiation having accelerated his degradation to critical levels. He had perhaps 12 hours left before systemic failure. He knew it. Picard knew it. And neither of them spoke about it. You're going to have to fight, Duke said simply. Against what? Picard replied. A creature we don't understand, with capabilities beyond our comprehension, piloted by enemies who have already demonstrated advanced technology we can barely analyze. Yeah, Duke agreed. That's what you call impossible odds. And you know what? I've had impossible odds my whole life. And I'm still here. Not because I followed the rules. Not because I waited for permission. But because I fought. Hard. Without hesitation. And many times you died in the process, Picard said quietly. Quadrant. Which means? Picard prompted. Which means, Data continued, the Romulans have brought through something from another dimension entirely. A being that has never encountered Federation technology, Federation diplomacy, or any of our defensive protocols. It is, in every meaningful sense, a completely unknown threat. Geordi LaForge's voice came through the comm from engineering. Captain, if that thing comes through and starts firing, our shields won't hold against power outputs like that. We're looking at maybe 3 minutes before the Enterprise is disabled. Maybe less. Can we evacuate? Picard asked. Not all of us, Crusher replied. Transporter capacity is limited. We could save maybe 60% of the crew before the power systems fail. Picard closed his eyes briefly. The mathematics of mortality. The calculus of who lives and who dies. This was the cost of command, not just tactical decisions, but the knowledge that your choices would determine which of your crew survived and which wouldn't. Duke entered the ready room without knocking, a habit he'd developed that no longer bothered Picard. The warrior was moving slower now, the chronoton radiation having accelerated his degradation to critical levels. He had perhaps 12 hours left before systemic failure. He knew it. Picard knew it. And neither of them spoke about it. You're going to have to fight, Duke said simply. Against what? Picard replied. A creature we don't understand, with capabilities beyond our comprehension, piloted by enemies who have already demonstrated advanced technology we can barely analyze. Yeah, Duke agreed. That's what you call impossible odds. And you know what? I've had impossible odds my whole life. And I'm still here. Not because I followed the rules. Not because I waited for permission. But because I fought. Hard. Without hesitation. And many times you died in the process, Picard said quietly. Yeah, Duke admitted. And I came back. That's what regeneration is for. It's not about being immortal. It's about getting back up after being knocked down. Picard stood and moved to the viewport. Somewhere out there, in the darkness between stars, the Romulans were preparing to open a rift that would bring something incomprehensible into Federation space. Somewhere else, Section 31 was preparing to move against him for harboring Duke. And somewhere on his ship, his crew was preparing for a battle they couldn't win. "I need to present our situation to the Federation Council," Picard said finally. "I need to ask for authorization to defend ourselves, which means authorization to attack Romulan space. Starfleet Command won't grant that without a compelling reason." "Then give them one," Duke said. "Tell them the truth. Tell them that the Romulans are bringing through an entity of unknown capability. Tell them that if they succeed, the Federation will be facing an enemy it cannot defend against. Tell them that hesitation now means extinction later." "The Federation Council doesn't respond well to fear-mongering," Picard said. "Then don't fear-monger," Duke replied. "Just tell them the facts. And let them decide what those facts mean." The council chamber on Earth was exactly what Picard expected: formal, deliberate, designed to encourage careful consideration rather than hasty action. The counselors represented dozens of worlds and species, each with their own strategic interests and concerns. Getting them to agree on anything was famously difficult. Getting them to agree on military action was nearly impossible. Picard presented his case with meticulous precision. He showed the sensor data. He explained the Romulan message. He laid out the tactical situation without embellishment or emotional appeal. Just facts. Cold, hard mathematics of threat assessment. When he was finished, the chamber fell silent. Finally, Counselor Tleck, a Vulcan with decades of diplomatic experience, stood to speak. "Captain, your presentation is compelling from a tactical perspective. However, I would note that the Federation has survived threats before. We have overcome the Borg, the Dominion, countless hostile species. What makes this particular threat different enough to warrant a preemptive strike against a sovereign power?" "The unknown factor," Picard replied. "In every previous encounter, we had some basis of understanding. We could analyze, predict, prepare. With this creature, we have none of those advantages. And the Romulans have deliberately chosen to bring it through precisely because we cannot defend against it." Then perhaps, another counselor suggested, we should prioritize evacuation and containment rather than confrontation. "Containment would require military forces we cannot spare," Picard countered. "And evacuation would abandon billions of Federation citizens to an enemy we don't understand. The only viable option is prevention, striking the Romulan research facility before they can open the dimensional rift." The debate continued for hours. Arguments and counterarguments. Strategic considerations weighed against diplomatic protocols. Fear of the unknown balanced against fear of acting without sufficient authority. Finally, at 2,100 hours, the Council voted. The decision was narrow. 51 to 47 in favor of authorizing Starfleet to conduct a preemptive strike against Romulan facilities in the neutral zone. It was the closest thing to an approval Picard would get. And it was barely enough. As he left the council chamber, a subspace message arrived from Admiral Satie: "Captain, you have made a grave strategic error. By choosing to protect that creature rather than surrender him, you have aligned yourself against Federation security interests. Consider this your final warning. Comply with the original directive to transfer the subject, or face immediate consequences." But Picard simply deleted the message and made his way back to the Enterprise. The die was cast. The battle was coming. And everything depended on decisions made in the next 12 hours. The revelation came not as a single moment of clarity, but as a cascade of data points that Data had been analyzing for 36 hours without finding the context that would make sense of them. The android stood in Picard's ready room at 0400 hours, his expression carrying something that resembled genuine confusion, a rare occurrence for a positronic being designed to process information with perfect clarity. "Captain, I have isolated an anomalous pattern in the chronoton particle composition," Data said, accessing the holographic display that rendered the temporal radiation in three-dimensional visualization. "The particles are not randomly distributed. They contain embedded information, a data structure encoded at the quantum level. Someone deliberately encoded a message within the radiation that brought Duke Nukem to our vessel." Picard felt the weight of that statement settle on him. "You're saying this wasn't an accident? The dimensional rift didn't simply pull Duke across by chance?" "Correct," Data confirmed. "The rift was deliberately calibrated to target Duke Nukem specifically. And the chronoton particles were deliberately structured to degrade his cellular cohesion at a predictable rate. Someone wanted him here, Captain. And someone wanted him dying." "The Romulans?" Picard asked. "Unlikely," Data replied. "The encoding signature predates Romulan temporal technology development by approximately 300 years. However, it does match certain theoretical frameworks developed by Section 31 in their classified Chronoton Research Division, research that was supposedly abandoned 15 years ago." The implications crashed over Picard like a wave. Section 31 brought Duke here. They deliberately created the dimensional rift knowing it would pull him across time and space. And they engineered the radiation to slowly kill him. That is one interpretation, Data agreed. However, there is additional information. The encoded message contains something else, a communication. It's fragmented, but I believe I can reconstruct it. Data's fingers flew across the holographic controls. Text began to materialize in the air, not English, but a language that Data immediately identified as a variant of 20th century Terran communication protocols. "It's from someone on Earth," Data said quietly. "Someone from Duke's time. The message says, 'Duke, if you're reading this, then the experiment worked. You've been transported to the future. The dimensional rift is controlled. The radiation is a tracking mechanism. When the time is right, we'll pull you back. But first, you need to understand what you are. You're not human. You're not a naturally evolved being. You're a weapon. A perfect combat organism designed by military scientists in your own era. And the people who created you have been watching, waiting for the moment when we could extract you again and use you for purposes you can't comprehend. You were never free, Duke. You were just in storage. And now your time has come." The message ended. The holographic display faded. And Picard realized he was looking at the most fundamental betrayal imaginable, not just of Duke, but of everything the Federation claimed to stand for. "Get Duke to the medical bay," Picard commanded. "Now. And contact Worf. I want him in the ready room immediately." Duke was asleep when Crusher found him in his quarters, his massive frame stretched across a bed that wasn't quite large enough to accommodate him. The chronoton radiation had progressed to the point where his skin was beginning to show the characteristic luminescent discoloration of advanced temporal particle integration. He had perhaps 6 hours left. Maybe less. When Crusher woke him and explained that Picard needed to see him immediately, Duke didn't ask questions. He simply stood, pulled on his shirt, and followed her to the ready room. When Picard explained what Data had discovered, Duke's reaction was not what Picard expected. There was no shock, no betrayal. Just a grim acceptance, as if some part of him had always known the truth. "Section 31, Duke said quietly. "They created me." "No," Data corrected gently. "Your genetic markers suggest naturally evolved human physiology with military enhancements. Section 31 did not create you. But they appear to have been aware of your existence and to have developed technology capable of extracting you across time." "That doesn't make sense," Picard said. Why would Section 31 deliberately create a temporal anomaly to bring Duke to us, then send that message knowing we'd discover it? They had to know we'd figure out they were involved. Unless, Worf said, arriving in the ready room as Picard had requested, they wanted us to figure it out. Unless the entire sequence of events was designed to manipulate our response. Duke stood by the viewport, staring at the stars beyond. His hand was shaking slightly, not from fear, Picard realized, but from the internal struggle of integrating new understanding into his worldview. They didn't create me, Duke said finally. But they experimented on me. Modified me. Made me into something more than human. And when they were done, they had me erased from historical records. Removed from Earth's timeline as if I'd never existed. I thought I was living a normal life, fighting aliens, protecting humanity. But I was just a test subject. An experiment in progress. We don't know that for certain, Crusher said gently, her medical training warring with her empathy for the man standing before her. The message is cryptic. It could be interpreted multiple ways. No, Duke said. His voice had taken on the quality of absolute clarity that came from finally understanding a truth you'd suspected all along. It's all there if you look at it right. I was enhanced by military scientists. I was monitored by Section 31. Every fight I had, every battle I survived, they were recording it, analyzing it, using me as a platform to develop better weapons. And when the Federation started asking uncomfortable questions about Section 31's activities, they decided to pull me out of storage. They sent me here deliberately. They wanted to see what would happen if a 20th century warrior encountered a 24th century civilization. But why? Picard asked. What purpose would that serve? Leverage, Data said, the answer coming to him through pure logical analysis. If Section 31 sent Duke through time, they could claim they were conducting emergency military research. If they could demonstrate that dimensional transposition technology was viable and beneficial, they could justify its development to the Federation Council. Duke would be the proof of concept. And the Romulans' dimensional rift? Worf asked. Also Section 31, Data concluded. Or at least, it appears that way. The Romulans may have been manipulated into conducting the experiments the same way we've been manipulated. Section 31 leaked the technology to them, knowing they would attempt to weaponize it. And now, when the crisis reaches its apex, when the Federation is threatened by a being we can't defend against, Section 31 will offer their own temporal weapons as the solution. Problem, reaction, solution. A classic manipulation sequence. Picard felt the layers of deception settling around him like a suffocating blanket. So everything that's happened, Duke's arrival, the Romulan threat, Section 31's demand for his custody, it's all been orchestrated. That is the most probable interpretation, Data confirmed. However, there is a complication. The message encoded in the chronoton particles contains a fail-safe mechanism. If Duke's biological signature reaches critical degradation without being extracted, the fail-safe initiates an automatic backup protocol. It will attempt to sever the dimensional connection between Duke and his point of origin. If that protocol activates before we can extract him manually, the results would be catastrophic. It would create a temporal shockwave that could destabilize spacetime across this entire sector. How long? Picard asked, though he already knew the answer. Based on the current rate of degradation, Crusher said quietly, approximately 4 hours. 4 hours. The same time frame in which the Romulan rift would open. The same time frame in which Section 31 would be positioned to offer their solution. The same time frame in which the Enterprise would be forced into a choice between impossible options. Duke requested a moment alone with Worf. The two warriors stood in the empty corridors of the Enterprise, and something passed between them that transcended words, a recognition that they were both men caught in circumstances beyond their control, forced to operate within systems that didn't understand them. I was a weapon, Duke said finally. My entire life was a lie. Everything I thought I was fighting for was just part of someone else's experiment. Perhaps, Worf replied. But your choices were not part of the experiment. Section 31 can manufacture circumstances, but they cannot manufacture the way a warrior responds to those circumstances. Your decisions, your values, your code, your refusal to submit to authority you didn't respect, those were yours. Were they? Duke asked bitterly. Or were they programmed into my genetic structure by the scientists who created me? Then we have a philosophical question, Worf said. If your values are programmed, does that make them less genuine? If your strength comes from enhancement, does that make your victories less earned? I have spent my entire life caught between two cultures, caught between instinct and discipline. And I have learned that what matters is not where we come from. What matters is what we choose to do with what we are. Duke was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked a question that seemed to surprise both of them. If we survive this, if we get through the next 4 hours, would you recommend I join Starfleet? Worf smiled. It was a rare expression on the Klingon's face. I would recommend you find your own path. But if that path led to serving aboard a starship, I would be honored to serve beside you. The final hours before the dimensional rift opened saw the Enterprise positioned at the edge of neutral zone space, cloaked and waiting. Picard had made his decision. They would allow the rift to open. They would observe what came through. And if it was truly the threat that the Romulan message suggested, they would fight, not because they had authorization, but because the alternative was allowing an unknown predator into Federation space. But first, they would attempt one final communication with Section 31. Picard recorded a personal message to Admiral Sati, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Admiral, I know what you've done. I know that you orchestrated Duke Nukem's arrival in this sector. I know that you've been manipulating both us and the Romulans toward this moment. And I want to be very clear, it ends now. Whatever you're planning, whatever you intended to gain by creating this crisis, it's over. The Federation Council will be informed of Section 31's involvement. The evidence is irrefutable. And if you attempt to move against this ship or this crew to cover up your activities, I will ensure that your organization is exposed, dismantled, and prosecuted for crimes against Federation citizens. This is not a threat. This is a promise. He sent the message and immediately afterward, he opened a channel to the Romulan research facility. Commander Vex, this is Captain Picard. I'm transmitting you a data packet containing evidence that your dimensional transposition technology was provided to you by Section 31 as part of a classified Federation operation. You are being used. The Romulan Star Empire is conducting experiments for an enemy that operates within the Federation itself. If you proceed with opening the dimensional rift, you will be serving Section 31's agenda rather than your own strategic interests. I suggest you reconsider your next move. The comm went silent. For 3 minutes, there was no response. Then Vex's voice returned, and there was something different in it, not friendship, but recognition of mutual manipulation. We are aware of Federation subterfuge, Captain. However, we will proceed with opening the rift. Not to acquire your guest. Not to demonstrate military capability. But to prove to our own government that we have the ability to develop technology independent of foreign interference. The Romulan Star Empire does not take orders from shadowy agencies. We take orders from ourselves. The comm cut off. And the dimensional rift began to open. Energy signatures cascaded across the Enterprise sensors like a supernova being contained in a bottle. The fabric of spacetime tore, and something began to push through. Something vast, something powerful, something that defied easy categorization or comprehension. This was the moment. The decision point. Everything that had happened, Duke's arrival, the manipulations, the deceptions, the impossible odds. It all culminated in this singular moment where the Federation would have to choose what it truly stood for. Picard took a deep breath and gave the order that would define his captaincy forever. Battle stations. All hands to combat positions. And someone tell Duke Nukem he's about to get exactly what he wanted, a fight that actually matters. The creature that emerged from the dimensional rift was not a single unified organism but a collective, a fusion of biological and technological systems that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously. Its primary form was humanoid, roughly 10 meters tall, with limbs that extended and retracted fluidly between states of matter and energy. Its skin, if it could be called that, shimmered with the iridescence of exotic matter being held in quantum suspension. Its eyes, if those were eyes, glowed with an intelligence that was ancient, cold, and utterly indifferent to the existence of lesser beings. The entity didn't speak. It simply began to move toward Federation space with the casual inevitability of gravity itself. Power output increasing, Geordi's voice crackled through the calm, "Captain, that thing is generating energy signatures we've never encountered. It's like watching a star learning how to walk." The Enterprise was cloaked, invisible to conventional sensors. But the creature didn't need conventional sensors. As it passed through the dimensional membrane, its gaze swept across the stars themselves, and somehow, impossibly, its attention fixed directly on the Enterprise's position. It had sensed them. "Shields up," Picard commanded. "Red alert. All weapons online but do not fire unless..." The creature moved. Not with the grace of a starship or the precision of a trained fighter. It moved like a hurricane, like gravity asserting dominance, like reality itself being rewritten. One moment it was in the dimensional rift. The next, it had crossed 10,000 kilometers and was directly above the Enterprise. Then it attacked. The energy beam that lanced down from the creature's form was not like phaser fire or disruptor blasts. It was something more fundamental, a directed manipulation of the quantum vacuum itself. Where it struck the Enterprise's shields, the energy didn't dissipate. It didn't bounce off. It penetrated, tearing through the shield generators as if they were paper. The bridge shook. Alarms screamed. Picard gripped his command chair as the lights flickered and died, replaced by emergency illumination that cast everything in harsh red. "Shields at 40% and dropping," Worf reported, his tactical display showing the shield matrix being systematically dismantled. "The creature's weapons are bypassing our defensive systems. Standard phaser fire has no effect. Photon torpedoes would require us to lower shields to launch, and we would not survive the firing sequence." "Evasive maneuvers," Picard ordered. "Get us away from that thing. Maximum impulse." The Enterprise lurched into motion, its engines straining to escape the creature's devastating assault. But the being was faster. Faster than anything Federation engineering could produce. Faster than logic suggested was possible for something that massive. Another energy beam struck, and this time it caught the Enterprise's starboard nacelle. The explosion was visible even through the forward view screen, a cascade of plasma and matter that lit up the void like a burning star. The ship's velocity dropped as one of the main engines went offline. "Hull breach on Deck 12, Data reported calmly, even as the ship continued to take punishment. 17 casualties in Engineering Section 7. Warp core integrity at 92%. We are experiencing cascading failures throughout the starboard power grid." They were losing. The Enterprise, the Federation's flagship, was being systematically dismantled by a being that didn't even seem to notice it was fighting. "Get Duke to the transporter room," Picard said quietly. "Now." "Captain." Worf looked at him in confusion. "He's the only asset we have that might make a difference," Picard continued. "Transport him directly to the creature's position. Let him do what warriors do. And pray to whatever gods might be listening that his regenerative factor is enough." It was a desperate gamble. It violated every tactical protocol, every strategic principle, every rule of engagement Starfleet had developed. It was also the only option they had left. Duke was already moving when the transporter beam caught him. He'd been waiting in the corridor outside the bridge, listening to the battle, understanding with his combat-honed instinct exactly what was about to happen. The materialization felt different this time. Not the usual shimmer of Federation transporter technology, but something rougher, more chaotic, performed under emergency conditions by an engineering crew operating at the edge of systemic collapse. He materialized in vacuum. The creature was directly above him, its vast form blocking out the stars. And Duke Nukem, a man from Earth's 20th century, a warrior whose entire life had been defined by fighting things that wanted to kill him, did what he had always done: he fought. His body had already begun to fail from the chronoton radiation. His cellular structure was degrading minute by minute. He should have been unconscious, incapacitated, dying. But instead, he activated his suit's thrusters, a piece of Federation equipment he'd learned to use in the 3 days since his arrival, and launched himself at the creature. The being barely registered his presence. To something that vast, that powerful, a human-sized warrior was less significant than a microorganism. It continued its assault on the Enterprise, its energy beams tearing through space with methodical precision. Duke grabbed onto one of the creature's limbs as it retracted toward its central mass. The touch was agony. The creature's outer surface radiated heat and exotic radiation that made his already failing body scream. But he held on. And as he climbed along the creature's form, he began to understand something fundamental about what he was fighting. Wasn't invulnerable. It was just overwhelmingly powerful. But power and invulnerability weren't the same thing. Beneath the layers of technological integration, beneath the quantum suspension fields and the exotic matter composites, there was biological material. There was a heart, a brain, systems that could be damaged if you knew where to strike. Duke had spent 40 years, 300 years, learning exactly where to strike. He reached the creature's optical sensor array and drove his fist directly into it. The blow should have broken his hand against material that dense. Instead, the sensor exploded in a burst of blue-white energy. The creature reacted for the first time, a convulsive shudder that dislodged Duke from its surface. He fell. The vacuum of space rushed up to meet him. His suit's thrusters engaged automatically, slowing his descent, and he grabbed onto another projecting limb, this one pulsing with the visible sign of a major power conduit. The creature's second attack beam was directed downward now, trying to eliminate Duke rather than the Enterprise. It was a mistake. The moment the creature diverted resources to deal with its small, persistent irritant, the Enterprise's crew seized the opportunity. Photon torpedoes, maximum yield. Picard commanded. Target the creature's central mass. 3 photon torpedoes launched from the Enterprise's remaining weapons pod. They struck the creature's body in rapid succession, each one detonating with the force of a small star going supernova. The explosion was beautiful and terrible, a cascade of energy that lit up the void and sent ripples of distortion through spacetime itself. The creature was thrown backward by the force of the impacts. And Duke, clinging to its surface, was thrown with it. He impacted against one of the creature's internal structures. Something that felt like organic tissue reinforced with synthetic material. The collision knocked the wind from his lungs. His vision darkened at the edges. Every system in his body was failing simultaneously. The chronoton radiation had reached critical levels. His regenerative factor, exhausted by hours of struggle against the temporal degradation, was beginning to shut down. This was it. This was how Duke Nukem died. Not in Las Vegas fighting alien invaders. Not in a battle he could win through sheer force and determination. But floating in the void between stars, trying to kill something so far beyond his capabilities that even a warrior's desperate courage wasn't going to be enough. His hands were slick with his own blood. Chronoton tainted, luminescent, the sign of a man being unmade at the molecular level. He raised one arm, trying to strike at the creature again, and found that his strength was gone. The radiation had won. The clock had run out. And then something happened that Duke didn't expect. The creature began to change. Its form, which had been so vast and overwhelming, began to collapse inward. The technological integration that had made it so formidable was shorting out, failing, breaking down under damage it had accumulated from the Enterprise's assault. But more than that, the creature seemed to be actively shutting down its own systems. Data's voice came through Duke's suit. Calm, fascinating. The creature appears to be entering a state of dormancy. Its power output is dropping exponentially. I believe it is undergoing a form of controlled shutdown, possibly a defensive response to damage exceeding its repair capacity. The creature's vast form went still. The light in its optical sensors dimmed and died. And floating against its now inert body, breathing hard in the vacuum suit that was his only connection to survival, Duke Nukem laughed. It was a sound of pure exhaustion and triumph mixed together in equal measure. He'd done it. Against impossible odds, against a creature that should have destroyed him instantly, against the certainty of his own death, he'd found a way to win. "Transporter, beam me back," he said, his voice rough and barely coherent. The shimmer caught him, and he was gone from the void, materialized in the Enterprise's transporter room where Crusher was waiting with medical equipment and absolute determination etched onto her face. The aftermath of battle was always the same: hours of assessment, repairs, casualty reports. The Enterprise had lost 37 crew members in the engagement. 42 more were injured. The starboard nacelle was a twisted ruin that would require spacedock-level repairs. But the ship was alive. The Federation was alive. In the medical bay, Duke lay in a stasis field while Crusher and her team worked frantically to stabilize him. The chronoton radiation had reached the point of systemic failure. His body was breaking down at the cellular level. Without intervention, he had minutes left. The fail-safe mechanism is activating, data reported from the terminal monitoring Duke's condition. The dimensional anchor encoded in his cellular structure is attempting to sever his connection to this dimension. If it succeeds, the temporal shockwave will be catastrophic. Can we stop it? Crusher asked, her hands moving with practiced precision as she attempted to isolate the chronoton particles. Theoretically, Data replied. But it would require rewriting his genetic structure at the quantum level. The procedure would essentially erase Duke Nukem as he currently exists and replace him with something different. Crusher looked down at the man in the stasis field. His body was barely holding together, luminescent with chronoton radiation, failing moment by moment. And she understood that sometimes saving a life meant fundamentally changing what that life was. "Do it," she said simply. When Duke's eyes opened again, the universe felt different. He was still in the medical bay. He was still Duke Nukem. But something had shifted at the fundamental level of his existence. The chronoton radiation was gone. His cellular structure had been rewritten, the temporal particles neutralized and incorporated into new genetic matrices that were stable, functional, and permanent. He sat up slowly, looking at his hands. They looked the same. They felt the same. But he could sense something new underneath, a kind of quantum resonance that hadn't been there before. The rewrite was successful, Data reported, his optical sensors brightening with what might have been something approaching satisfaction. Your genetic structure is now stable. However, the procedure has altered your cellular composition in profound ways. You are no longer purely human. Your biology now incorporates quantum-level modifications that allow you to exist stably in this dimension without the chronoton radiation degradation. You are, in essence, a hybrid, part human, part quantum entity, part something entirely new. So I'm a freak, Duke said, though there was no bitterness in his voice. Just acceptance. You are evolution, Data corrected. You are proof that beings can transcend their original nature and become something greater. By Federation standards, that makes you remarkable, not freakish. Picard entered the medical bay. The captain looked exhausted but satisfied, the expression of a man who'd made impossible choices and somehow emerged on the other side. "How are you feeling?" Picard asked. Like I died and got rebuilt, Duke said. So, about normal for me. Picard smiled. The Federation Council has made a decision regarding your status. Section 31 is being formally investigated for their role in orchestrating the dimensional rift and manipulating events to create this crisis. Admiral Satie has been removed from command pending a full inquiry. And you, Picard paused, have been offered the opportunity to become a Federation citizen. If you choose to accept, you would be free to pursue any path you wish. Starfleet service, civilian life, exploration. The choice would be yours. And if I decline? Duke asked. Then you're free to leave, Picard said. Though I suspect you won't. Duke was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything that had happened. About being a weapon, about discovering the truth, about being remade at the quantum level. About a federation that claimed to stand for ideals and sometimes fell short of them, but kept trying anyway. I'll stay, Duke said finally. At least for a while. I want to see if this Federation thing actually works. Worf appeared in the medical bay doorway, his expression unreadable. Mr. Nukem. I came to inform you that combat simulations have been scheduled for 0900 hours tomorrow. I believe your input would be valuable in developing new defensive protocols. I'll be there, Duke said. As they filed out, leaving Duke alone in the medical bay with Crusher, the doctor smiled at him, a smile that held understanding of what he'd endured and respect for what he'd become. Welcome to Starfleet, she said simply. Try not to destroy too many holodecks. No promises, Duke replied. Outside the viewport, the vast form of the creature remained inert, contained now by a specialized stasis field that the Enterprise's engineers had rigged from salvaged technology. Scientists would study it for years, learning its secrets, understanding the principles of its construction. But that was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, the Enterprise had survived. Duke had survived. And the Federation had been reminded that sometimes the greatest victories came not from following the rules, but from having the courage to break them when the situation demanded it. In the command chair on the bridge, Picard watched the creature drift in space and made a note in his captain's log. Whatever else may be said about Duke Nukem, his arrival has fundamentally changed our understanding of what we're capable of becoming. Not just as a Federation, but as individuals. Sometimes growth requires chaos. Sometimes transformation requires the willingness to be broken and rebuilt. And sometimes, a warrior from the past can teach a civilization of the future exactly what it means to never surrender, no matter how impossible the odds. He paused, then added, I suspect Duke Nukem's story is far from over. And I find myself curious to see where it leads. Outside, the stars continued their eternal dance. The void between dimensions remained closed. And Duke Nukem, a man from another time, in another body, in another life, finally allowed himself to sleep. Conclusion. The Federation Council's decision to formally indict Section 31 for crimes against Federation citizens sent shockwaves through the political and military structures that had relied on the organization's shadow operations for decades. Admiral Satie was detained pending trial. The classified research facilities were seized. And for the first time in its history, Section 31 faced the prospect of genuine public scrutiny and accountability. But the real transformation didn't come from institutional restructuring. It came from what happened on the bridge of the Enterprise D in the weeks following Duke's quantum reconstruction. Captain Picard commissioned a comprehensive review of the Prime Directive's application in real-world scenarios. He presented case studies, including the Trell labor camps they'd observed during reconnaissance, to the Federation Council with a specific recommendation. That the Prime Directive, while valuable as a general principle, required contextual interpretation that accounted for moral imperatives when sentient beings faced existential threats. The debate that followed would reshape Federation policy for generations to come. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. The Prime Directive would remain in effect, but Starfleet captains would be granted increased discretionary authority to intervene in scenarios where advanced civilizations were actively enslaving or committing genocide against less technologically developed species. It wasn't the complete overhaul that Duke would have preferred, but it was progress. It was the Federation acknowledging that absolute non-interference could sometimes be as morally indefensible as reckless intervention. Duke didn't serve on the council. He didn't engage in political debates or policy discussions. Instead, he did exactly what Worf had suggested: he found his own path. By day, he served as a combat instructor aboard the Enterprise D, teaching Starfleet officers what it meant to fight not for honor or glory, but for survival and principle. His methods were unconventional, often brutal, always direct, but his students learned. They learned that there were enemies that couldn't be reasoned with, threats that required immediate, decisive action. They learned that protocols and procedures were valuable, but not when they prevented you from doing what was necessary. By night, he sat with Counselor Troy, working through the psychological implications of his transformation. The man who had arrived on the Enterprise carrying anger and bravado gradually began to understand that strength could coexist with vulnerability. That being remade at the quantum level didn't erase who he'd been, it simply gave him the chance to choose who he wanted to become. The creature that Duke had fought, the vast being from the alternative dimension, remained in stasis, a mystery waiting to be solved. Scientists debated its origins, its purpose, its place in the broader tapestry of the multiverse. But Duke understood something that the theorists didn't: that creature hadn't been evil. It had simply been vast, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the existence of smaller beings. It was a reminder that the universe contained forces that transcended morality, that challenged the comfortable assumption that good and evil were universal concepts. The dimensional rift technology that the Romulans had employed was eventually reverse-engineered and contained. Section 31 scientists were interrogated, their research analyzed, their methodologies documented for historical records that would serve as a cautionary tale for future generations. The technology itself was deemed too dangerous for practical application and was locked away in a vault buried beneath the most secure Federation facility, guarded and monitored by the very organization that had tried to misuse it. 3 months after the battle with the creature, Duke received a visitor in his quarters. It was a Starfleet admiral, not Sati, but someone different. Younger, more principled, someone who represented what Starfleet could be when it wasn't compromised by fear and institutional pressure. "We'd like you to consider a formal commission as a Starfleet officer," the admiral said simply. "Not in a traditional capacity. You'd have significant latitude in how you operate, what assignments you take, what protocols you follow. But we need people like you. People who understand that sometimes the rulebook needs to be rewritten to address unprecedented threats." Duke considered the offer carefully. He thought about Earth, the Las Vegas of his time, the world he'd lost to dimensional transposition and temporal displacement. He thought about the Federation, with all its flaws and its desperate attempts to do better. He thought about Worf, and Picard, and even Data with his constant quest to understand human emotions through intellectual analysis. "I'll do it," Duke said finally. "But on one condition." "What's that?" "I get to keep calling myself Duke Nukem. I'm not becoming Commander Nukem or Captain Nukem. I'm Duke. That's who I am. That's who I choose to be. And if Starfleet can't accept that, then we don't have a deal." The Admiral smiled. "I can live with that." The final entry in Captain Picard's log regarding Duke Nukem was written 6 months after the Dimensional Rift incident, as the Enterprise was preparing for a new mission to deep space. Duke Nukem has been formally commissioned as a Starfleet officer with the rank of Commander, specializing in tactical scenarios and unconventional threat response. His service record already shows remarkable progress. He has adapted to Federation culture far more quickly than anyone anticipated, though he maintains his essential nature as a warrior who challenges authority when that authority conflicts with what he believes is right. What strikes me most about Duke is not his physical capabilities or his combat prowess, though both are formidable. What strikes me is his fundamental belief that beings, whether human, Klingon, or something entirely new, have the capacity to transcend their origins. He was created as a weapon by military scientists. He could have allowed that fact to define him. Instead, he chose to become something more, a soldier, yes, but also a teacher, a friend, someone willing to question the systems he serves because he believes those systems can be better. The Prime Directive, Section 31, the Romulan Star Empire, all of these forces tried to use Duke for their own purposes. And in every instance, he refused to be used. He insisted on agency, on choice, on the right to determine his own path. That kind of resistance to manipulation, that refusal to be anyone's tool, may be the most valuable lesson the Federation has learned from his arrival. I began this log wondering if Duke Nukem could survive in a universe governed by science and diplomacy. The answer is not just that he can survive. He's thriving. And in doing so, he's forcing us all to consider what survival actually means. Is it merely continued existence? Or is it the freedom to choose your own path, to make your own mistakes, to become more than you were designed to be? Duke has chosen the latter definition. And the Federation is better for having to confront that choice alongside him. On the observation deck of the Enterprise D, Duke Nukem stood watching the stars. The chronoton radiation that had threatened to unmake him had instead remade him into something unprecedented, a bridge between dimensions, a being who existed in quantum superposition with his original timeline while fully present in this new reality. He thought about the question Worf had posed months ago: if your values are programmed, does that make them less genuine? And he'd come to understand the answer. His values weren't programmed. They were chosen. Section 31 might have enhanced his body, given him strength and durability and the capacity to regenerate from damage that would kill ordinary humans. But they couldn't program his soul. They couldn't dictate the choices he made when facing impossible situations. That was something he'd done for himself. That was something every being capable of thought and consciousness had to do for themselves. The stars beyond the viewport suddenly shifted as the Enterprise entered warp, beginning its journey toward new discoveries, new encounters, new impossible situations waiting to be resolved. Duke felt the subtle vibration of faster-than-light travel, the sensation of reality bending around the ship, and he smiled. He was going to like the future. It was violent and uncertain and full of beings who didn't understand him. Which meant it was exactly like Earth had been. Which meant he was, finally, exactly where he belonged. In the darkness between stars, in the spaces where civilizations encountered each other and had to decide what they truly stood for, Duke Nukem had found his purpose. Not as a weapon. Not as someone else's tool. But as himself. A warrior. A teacher. A being who refused to surrender, no matter how impossible the odds. And proof, living, breathing, impossible proof. That even in a universe of science and logic, sometimes the most important victories came from pure, stubborn, absolutely unreasonable determination to never accept defeat. The Enterprise sailed on through the void, carrying with it a man from another time, another world, another existence entirely. And somewhere in the quantum foam that underlaid all of reality, the dimensional barrier between his origin and his present began to settle into equilibrium, not erased, but transformed. No longer a wound, but a scar. Evidence of survival. Duke Nukem had come to the Star Trek universe expecting a fight. What he'd found instead was transformation. And as the Enterprise jumped to warp speed, carrying him toward whatever came next, he understood that the greatest battles weren't the ones you won through strength alone. They were the ones that changed you so fundamentally that you could never go back to who you were before. And that made all of them worth fighting. Live long and prosper. More stories await.